dogs and flip burgers and all that stuff. Just a couple of words before we begin. More exciting. Those of you who are new, like beer, the Alumni Association gathering, some more for something that we started doing many years ago. Father Nicholas was kind of original. We had the alumni would kind of all gang up some on the seminary on this day of orientation week, and so that is what hot dogs and flip burgers and all that stuff. And then we added some more exciting things to it, like beer. And happy to have some more fraternity stuff. And then first, I want to Father Nicholas was second. Wouldn't that be great if we had a second night thing? Perhaps we could quite unknowingly already alumni. Were you aware of that? So that you don't have to graduate to become alumni. We weren't able to do it last year for obvious reasons here, but we're back up and running. And then you were part of the Alumni Association. So happy to have our bylaws. First, I want to welcome along as you are a seminarian, because you and your spouse students don't have to pay dues. Quite unknowingly already alumni. Were you aware of that? You don't have to graduate to become alumni. So, complete 1 year of courses. The new students, Tikhon, welcome, and then you're part of the Alumni Association. We're so happy to meet you. Our bylaws state that as long as you are a seminarian, you and your spouse, this week is an interesting guess what I'm coming after you for. None of us have been together in some time. 20 bucks. We're getting to redo that now and enjoy each other's company. To the new students, I want welcome. If you have not planned on coming, we're so happy to meet you. To change your plan to spend a little bit of your family with you. I think almost at least to greet you. It's just time for us. This week is no schedule for this because the alumni have been together and are going to prepare dinner. We're getting to want to help that. You're very welcome to enjoy each other's company tonight. I want, if any of you have not planned on coming this evening, I'd like everybody have a copy of the little schedule and have a good time. If you don't have one, just raise your hands and Father Nikolai will bring one. No schedule for this evening. The alumni, along with Zena, so I'll just speak this aloud very briefly. You're very welcome to, but you're not obliged to. But tonight is just to be and to enjoy each other's company. Does everybody have a copy of the little schedule? If you don't have one, could you raise your hands and Father Nikolai will bring one to you. So I'll just speak this aloud very briefly. Today we're beginning now with our first seminar with Dr. Vitali. Then we'll have kind of a little break, and then at 3 o'clock we usually do a small group discussion, but I think we're anticipating that there'll be a lot of questions. So Dr. Vitali is going to lead a Q&A session instead of just a small group discussion. And then, of course, Vespers at 4:30 at the monastery. And then the alumni-sponsored cookout will be at 6 o'clock this evening, approximately 6 o'clock. So ask those of you who come to go to Vespers, please come right back afterwards and come celebrate with us. Alumni, at the conclusion of the Q&A session, we'll be talking about responsibilities for the cookout this evening. So all alumni, we will have duties here. I know Zena wants to do everything, but she cannot, contrary to what she might have told us already. So we all have stuff that we have to do to help get things ready. Then for tomorrow, the alumni board, that's the other officers and I, will serve Divine Liturgy. That's roughly 6:30, as you know, at the monastery church. And then we'll have breakfast here in the refectory, and then we'll start here promptly at 8:30 with our second session. And then at 10 o'clock tomorrow, we'll have our annual meeting, which this year will include elections. And then we'll conclude our day together tomorrow after lunch. So, that being said, again, welcome to all of our first-year students and to our second-year students. I welcome you to the Alumni Association. And with that, I will hand the podium over to our dear Father John Parker.
I'd just like to point out before I get to the podium, two cool things. We have one St. Tikhon's alumnus, Father Khadar. George is his English name. He serves in the church that's about right here, right now, the Church of Holy Sepulchre, at this church just outside the front doors. Here's Golgotha. You come out the main doors of the church here right now, and that's where he serves. That's pretty cool.
It is. That's right. It is that building.
St. James. Yeah, St. James Church. And Nick Nunu in the first class, he was baptized about right there. In that church. I mean, it's the church built on top of that church on top of that church, but that's pretty cool. Anyway. Nice to have those kinds of connections. Glory to Jesus Christ.
Glory forever.
A warm welcome to you all, y'all, alumni especially who have come back to join us. It's a joy, even if it is a slow rollout of coming back in person and visiting and those sorts of things. It's a great joy for us to be in person, the students, the faculty in the coming week, you all who have driven from not exactly near, but just on the near edge of far to be with us. Thank you for that. I think I know that we're in for a wonderful treat. I'll talk about my friend and classmate, Dr. Vitali, in just a moment. I'd like to share just a few words, especially for the benefit of the alumni who are visiting and those who may be watching, about some of the amazing things that are happening at our seminary. Right now, for example, the incoming class nearly doubles the seminary. So in the second and third year classes, we have 22 returning students. In the first year class, we have 21 students. This is a beautiful thing. Not the largest class ever, but the largest class in recent memory, and we were very grateful, as we've already expressed to the incoming students, that the Lord is sending a bounty to us. And we know ourselves, even just from the daily news, that the needs for clergy and parishes is increasing by the day, including just yesterday. So I thank God for that. Here at the seminary, in terms of the physical plant, we have had an amazing amount of work going on. The COVID season actually turned out to be a blessing in this regard, that we were able to focus on our house a little bit during that season. So I hope that during your time here, you'll have a chance to walk around, and I hope that you will notice the changes, but here are a few things that you might consider seeing. First of all, if you've not been back in at least 2 years, you'll notice that the faculty wing of the upstairs of the seminary is completely and totally remodeled. There is, when you come in the main doors of the seminary and turn left, the first door on the left, which at some recent season was the finance office, and in more recent season was Dr. Busalis' office, is now an everyone but students lounge, where faculty and alumni and other meetings can occur. Please feel free to go in there, alumni. In this case, we use alumni in the technical sense, not the St. Tikhon sense. But as you move a little further down the hall, you'll notice on the left-hand side a beautiful icon of St. Nikolai. It's a tall, skinny one like this. Some of you from back in the day will know that better than any of us. That photograph, that icon is painted from a photograph which was taken at the double doors, which were in Father Gabriel's office, which is the next room to that beautiful icon. At least one of the seminarians in that icon is Father Yaroslav, our graduate, who now resides in retirement in Quantico, Virginia, who himself was a Kalenic to St. Nikolai. If you keep coming down that hallway, you'll find a room on the left-hand side which has a door that doesn't match any of the other doors. It's a beautiful carved church door, a little bit unfinished still, but that was St. Nikolai's study. That's where he prayed and reposed. It's interesting. There are as many opinions about where exactly St. Nikolai was living, dying, reading, writing, praying, as there are about COVID and vaccines. But the general consensus is that room, which is now becoming the shrine to St. Nikolai, was at least part of the room in which he once lived. If you go into the chapel upstairs, you will see a desk that has all kinds of coffee cup stains on it. It's not that you just thought, we don't have a place for this desk, let's put it in the chapel because we don't have another storage place. No, that's St. Nikolai's desk. It just hasn't gotten into his shrine yet. It was given to us from across the street at the museum, and likewise his vestments, which are in the room next to the shrine, at least partially renovated since the visits of many of you all. The paneling has been replaced with drywall and painted due to the graciousness of Father Sergius, the abbot. We have a collection of very beautiful icons that have been given to us for use in that chapel, including some that were given by the Patriarch of Moscow for the millennium of Christianity in Russia, 1988. So all around, one room at a time. Just out this door over here, it's still a bit rough because we are a place under construction, but at the terminal end of the short hallway, you can take a peek in there. That's our new Ancient Faith studio. We had There's the new dorm, which is actually just the dorm. Well, it's like this is the new Ancient Faith studio. We had another Ancient Faith studio over there, which was new then, but now we're going to be moving this camera and all of its related components into there, and we'll have one side which is radio and one side which is video. So we're trying to do everything that we can to make sure that the beautiful lamp of St. Tikhon shines brightly from on top of a digital mountain at least, so that people who are far away and maybe never have heard either about St. Tikhon's or from St. Tikhon's can learn about this place. As I mentioned 3 years ago in my remarks at the All-American Council, that amazing occasion where I had been appointed about 8 days before and told, go give a speech about St. Tikhon's. Having been here for one total day, I mentioned that there are, I would say, at least half of the membership of the Orthodox Church in America has never been to St. Tikhon's, at least half, probably far more. And many, many more than that, I would suspect, haven't heard of St. Tikhon's or know what we do. And we're trying to change that through that kind of outreach, for example. The same thing would be true in a different sort of way with the new Tikhon. So if you did not receive a copy of the springtime Tikhon, I say springtime because now we also have a fall-time Tikhon, which will be coming out in October. We have some extra copies upstairs. We aim to congratulate the graduating class as a sort of theme in the Memorial Day Tikhon, and we hope to welcome the incoming class as a sort of theme in the what we'll call the Founders Day edition. So please look forward to that. This October will be the first time that's been done to my knowledge. So we're grateful for those kinds of things. There's lots of other good and many more exciting things that are happening here. There are actually some rather gigantic things that I would like to tell you about, but I'm going to just let that be one of those things that arouses the appetite without bending back down. I'll share with you some of those greater points at a time that's more appropriate. Today, however, we have the great gift of my classmate, Dr. Vitaly Permyakov. Dr. Permyakov and I knew one another as Vitaly and Jay, or Vitaly and John, back at St. Vladimir's. We met in the year 2002 when I was very fresh-eyed, like many of you who have been here for only 4 days. That's the equivalent of when I met Dr. Permyakov. We studied only for 1 year together. However, we have been able to be in touch over the years without missing too many heartbeats in the middle of all that. Dr. Permyakov comes from, well, he comes from overseas. However, he hails from the Dallas Cathedral, yes, and was in a certain kind of way a son of Archbishop Dmitri. Is it fair to say?
I was acquainted with him.
Yes. I recall that you used to translate in the Dawn. Do I recall? The Dawn was the newspaper of the Diocese of the South. Dr. Permyakov went on to dedicate his life to the study of liturgical theology. And after graduating St. Vladimir's, went to earn his PhD at Notre Dame. His PhD thesis was related to the Byzantine service for the consecration of a church. I hope if you have not had the experience to take part in the consecration of a church, that you will actually build one and get to do that, because it is a most beautiful, awesome thing. I had the chance to be at the consecration of the church in Savannah, Georgia. I had a chance to be at a rodeo of a church consecration, the cathedral in Tirana, Albania, which happened maybe 7, 8 years ago. If you want to hear about many traditions, one church, which is the topic of Dr. Vitaly's speech today, I could tell you some wild stories from the consecration of the church there. And then more personally had a chance to take part in the consecration of our own church at Holy Ascension in Mount Pleasant, South Carolina. In short, that is the baptism and chrismation and vesting of the altar and the blessing of the church is really amazing experience. So Dr. Vitaly Permyakov is one of the more recent experts in the question of the Byzantine rite of the consecration of the church. Today, he's been invited to give a number of talks, which he's entitling Many Traditions, One Church, knowing our roots. And I see that at least in part we're going to begin at the most amazing Church of the Holy Sepulchre in one form or another. So without further ado, please welcome my friend and classmate, Dr. Vitaly Termikov.
Thank you very much, Father John. That's a kind introduction. Thank you for dear fathers and brothers. Thank you for the invitation. It is a great honor to be here. It's my first time speaking at St. Tikhon's. Even though I have been here many times and always enjoyed being here. Whether I was in my previous appointment, I was at Holy Trinity Seminary in Jordanville, and then right now I'm at St. Vladimir Seminary. It's equidistant, I think, from both places, so I'm glad that I always have a chance to come and visit. My talk is entitled, as Father John said, Many Traditions, One Church, Knowing Our Roots. And it's very generic title, and because it gives me an opportunity to talk about liturgical history, both elements of liturgical history that I can hopefully introduce you to, and also to talk about the value of liturgical history for our work in the church. That why do we need to know? Maybe it is cool to know some of the us. Maybe it's interesting for some, not interesting for others. But why do we need to know it? What is the value of it? So I hope So I will start with the aspects, some examples of liturgical history. How do we study? What do we look at? How do we study? What do we know about aspects of early liturgical history? And then I will end with some concluding remarks regarding generally the value. Why do we do this? The purpose of this. The purpose of what I'm actually doing for a living. And then I hope we will end with some questions, whether during this hour or I think it might spill over into the Q&A session. And this is, of course, questions are always fun. So if we suddenly have found ourselves in the late 4th century in the city of Jerusalem, standing in the courtyard of a recently constructed Church of the Holy Sepulchre, we would behold a sight which would be recognizable and slightly unfamiliar to us at the same time. As the 4th century Spanish pilgrim Egeria, who visited Holy City around 381-383 AD, she described that early in the morning, at the dawn, even before dawn, all the doors of the anastasis are open before the cockcrow each day, and the monks and the pilgrims come in, and also some laymen and women. The priests say prayers and deacons say litanies, but from then until daybreak they join in singing the refrains to the hymns, psalms, and antiphons. As soon as dawn comes, they start the morning office, and the bishop with his clergy comes and joins them. So the bishop goes into the cave of the anastasis. And the setting for this, this is just one example of the service, the daily service which you described, which clearly separates into sections. That is the section where is a continuous chanting of psalms and antiphons. However, we do not actually know which psalms were chanted and which prayers were said by the presbyters, since no contemporary liturgical books have survived from Jerusalem of that time. But the setting of that service, as well as other services described by Egeria, and likewise it's described in other sources regarding Jerusalem liturgy from the first millennium, that is Armenian lectionary, which deals with describes the gives a lectionary for the services of the liturgical year and dated to the early 5th century, and then the Georgian lectionary covering from about 6th to 8th century. But the setting is very clear. So the setting is that the setting is based on the construction of the church on the side of Christ's death and resurrection. As Eusebius describes this, church historian Eusebius describes that from about 325, 327 AD, they started building the church on the site of what was previously a pagan temple, and they deliberately positioned that church to be facing the destroyed first temple, the second temple, the ruins of the second Jerusalem temple. If you go to Jerusalem this day, this is the site of the second Jerusalem temple. Second temple, the site of it is where you see the Dome of the Rock. I mean, you immediately see that. So it's a shining, the shining dome, which you can see from everywhere. But when they started converting this space, this city, into which was a Roman city for about 200 years, they started converting it into a Christian city. They deliberately positioned the Church of the Holy Sepulchre to be across and almost facing the ruined second temple, the ruined old temple. So they were building this new, quote-unquote, new temple, new Christian temple, and they almost like as if by accident came across the tomb of Christ. Likewise, at the same time, we date, kind of retroactively date also the discovery of the true cross. So because of these two important sites, two important locations at this Golgotha, the place of Christ's crucifixion, and the site of the empty tomb, we see that at that point, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which we call Church of the Holy Sepulchre, complex of the Holy Sepulchre, consisted as if of two churches conjoined together. So there is the round rotunda is the site of the empty tomb, and at the easternmost wall of the basilica, you would find the site of Golgotha, which also had a separate chapel behind that location as well. But in the current church setting, if you do this next slide, in the current setting of the church, if you compare what was and compare it to what we have now, which is the picture photographed above, you see that the only elements of the original structure which still remain, these are the place of Christ's tomb and the site of Golgotha. This entire structure was first damaged in the 7th century during the Persian invasion, and then was completely destroyed, or if not completely, but mostly destroyed in year 1009 by the order of the Fatimid Caliph al-Hakim. It was very soon rebuilt, but it was never rebuilt in the same form in which it used to be from the 4th to 11th century. When Egeria describes the monks and virgins and some laity, some priests and deacons assembling before dawn and serving the service of morning praise or the night praise, we see that they gather in this open courtyard between the Church of the Holy between the Basilica and the Church of the Holy and the Church of the Holy Anastasis, the Chapel of the Holy Anastasis on the side of Christ's tomb. So they gather in this space and they sing, presumably antiphonally, hymns and antiphons, hymns and psalms and antiphons, but we don't know what they were because no texts have survived. There is a speculation that the texts which are found in the collection of hymnography which has survived only in Georgian translation, which is known under the Georgian name Yadgari, which means usually identified with a liturgical book, which was most likely called Trapologia. Trapologia is a collection of trapartia. So there is a speculation that some of these hymns have actually go back to the late 4th century, but there is no proof. It's a speculation. There is no proof there is no actual proof that actual evidence that there is any that some of these hymns actually do come from the late 4th century. So if we would come to this service, we would hear the hymns, but we wouldn't recognize them, assuming, of course, we would be able to understand spoken and literary Greek at that point, of that time. We probably would not recognize the hymns, we probably would not recognize the prayers, but the form of celebration would be recognizable to us. That is, it is a service of morning praise. It is a service which starts before dawn and then continues until the morning, when the most solemn part of the service begins with the entrance of the bishop. And that setting of the morning service, what we call matins, that setting is close to what we know. If we fast forward to the 6th century, next one, and relocate to another important liturgical and ecclesiastical center, the monastic community of the Lavra of Venerable Savas the Sanctified, also Marsava, at some distance from Jerusalem. Now I think you can reach it in a couple of hours by car, but it will be much longer trip of that at that point. But there is, despite this distance, there is a definite evidence for a close connection between St. Savas, between Marsava and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. One of the great hymnographers associated associated with the Church of Jerusalem in the 8th century was St. John of Damascus. He has been speculated he was actually not only a monk, but also he was a priest attached to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the Church of the Holy Anastasis. So there is a connection, and most likely the services which were celebrated in Marsava, these were adapted form of the services celebrated in Holy Anastasis in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Most likely there was no separate monastic rite versus the Jerusalem Cathedral rite, but it was one and the same rite, just adapted to the local circumstances. But from some evidence that we do have, from a Orologian, which also incidentally also preserved only in Georgian and has been studied by one of the most important current liturgical scholars, who is a Norwegian Orthodox, Stig Frøyskov. He identified this book, this manuscript, as the 6th century Orologion of St. Savas, of St. Savas Monastery, and that service if we would come and see that service at Marsava, it would actually surprise us, because not only we would encounter familiar hymnography and psalmody. So we would come and would hear 6 psalms, Psalm 50, the biblical odes and psalms of praises, but not in the course of one service, but 2 services. The fixed psalmody of the beginning, which is for us at the beginning of Matins, 6 psalms, for example, that would be associated with the night service, with service celebrated during the night, or rather at 12th hour of the night, so roughly midnight. And the morning office, beginning with the Psalm 50, would be celebrated at 6th hour of the night, which is which is 6 a.m. roughly. And only in, as we now understand that only in the mid-8th century, in Palestinian liturgical tradition, we see the merger of these two services into a lengthy orthros, or matins, which we are familiar today. Gradually we see that instead of celebrating two services separate, two night service and a morning service, the two services merged into the one lengthy orthros, and which essentially by its structure and by its origin constitutes two services packed into one. And before this discovery, just as a note, even before this discovery of that, or study rather, manuscript was discovered a long time ago, but it was not studied, and study of that manuscript, scholars speculated that actually Byzantine matins, Byzantine orthros is at least two services packed into one because of its rather extreme length. But actually, the way scholars speculated about that is precisely through the comparison with the similar services in other liturgical rites, in other Eastern liturgical rites. So, however, when the same monastics, as well as their fellow Christians in other churches in Palestine, including at the Holy Sepulchre, would be gathered for a Eucharistic synaxis, the rite which they would celebrate would be Liturgy of St. James, the main Eucharistic liturgy of the Church of Jerusalem, which is today is treated for us as either a service with which we're completely unfamiliar, or is treated as a kind of an antique curiosity, or occasionally also misrepresented as the original apostolic liturgy, which is where the attribution of that service to St. James is taken as absolutely at the face value. I mean, if you're interested, we can talk more about that. So next step, if we traverse the Mediterranean and consider the services celebrated in the great church, the grand and majestic cathedral of Hagia Sophia, magnificently built by Justinian after the design of Isidore of Miletus and Euthymius of Tralles, and that the result of that design is this massive and magnificent dome which overshadows the cathedral, which you can still see and enjoy today. Yes, this slide shows the location of all of the churches in Constantinople at that in the Byzantine period, and the Cathedral of Hagia Sophia was located next to, as you see, it is located next to public open spaces. It's close to the forum, and the elongated structure next to Hagia Sophia is the great hippodrome, which you still can see some. You can still see Hagia Sophia, you can see parts of hippodrome, it's mostly gone. The chariot which stood at the top of the gates of the hippodrome, it's in Venice, it was stolen. Basically it was almost suggested that putting the great cathedral of Hagia Sophia next to the hippodrome, or rather hippodrome next to Hagia Sophia, is like putting AMC movie theater next to the church. That was the site, the hippodrome was the site of the main attraction of that, for the population. And it's also a site where the emperor would also always be present at the services in Hagia Sophia when he was able, and would also be present at the races in hippodrome. And would also, because his presence would also validate and legitimize this event as having not just a sporting event, but also having a significant political value. So if we come, for example, to that cathedral for the service of Vespers, next one, if we enter that cathedral, well, it looks today, this is how it looked before it was reconverted into the mosque, before the carpet was reintroduced. And so he would come to Vespers, serve according to the cathedral rite of Constantinople. First of all, you most likely would not be able to enter this magnificent cathedral, because if you would come in, you would see that most of the people and the choirs are assembled in a narthex, in the really spacious narthex next to, which just before the main doors of Hagia Sophia. And we will hear some familiar phrases and prayers. We will hear familiar opening exclamation, which would not, however, be the exclamation which of Vespers, with which we are familiar with, blessed is our God. It would be blessed is the kingdom, most likely. Instead of Psalm 103, bless the Lord, O my soul, the opening psalm, which we'll hear not read but chanted with refrains by the choirs and with the verses intoned by the protopsaltes, they would be Psalm 85, incline thy ear to me, O Lord. However, the prayers preceding the psalmody, if we would be able to hear them, most likely they were already silent by the end of first millennium. The prayers would be actually very recognizable, for these are the same prayers which in the current Byzantine rite the priest silently reads in the beginning of Vespers, standing before the holy doors. And you would know that these prayers belong to a different liturgical tradition, because the opening, the first vesperal prayer, first prayer of light, lamp lighting prayer, is actually, if you put it next to Psalm 85, you see that it's a paraphrase of Psalm 85, which was the opening psalm of the Constantinopolitan Vespers, and not the, but Psalm 103, however, was the opening psalm of the Palestinian Vespers. Moreover, the service at the Cathedral of Vespers in Hagia Sophia also, even if it did not ever leave the cathedral, it still incorporated a procession, a movement, an entrance from the narthex into the nave. Indeed, the three portions of the service were celebrated in three locations inside the Hagia Sophia complex: narthex, nave, and sanctuary, where the clergy would enter at the end of the service. Can I have the next one? So this is a reconstruction of the approximate reconstruction of the magnificent interior, with the ciborium over the altar, the templon type icon barrier, so the altar barrier, and the ambo, elevated ambo, which, however, I think it was actually should be somewhat higher, because some sources suggest that the choir was able to assemble underneath the ambo, and therefore it was actually slightly higher, I think. But of course, none of these structures have survived. If you go into Hagia Sophia today and you visit the courtyard, where you have a lot of architectural discoveries, you will find that there is a remnants of an ambo, elevated platform, kind of like this butterfly-shaped elevated platform, but it is not the ambo from Hagia Sophia. It is from the smaller church. The only way that we actually know that this is how the church might have looked is that from studying historical sources, and from studying liturgical sources, and comparing and aligning them with the architectural evidence. And when the same Orthodox Christians at the end of the first millennium came to the Divine Liturgy, celebrated according to the order attributed to St. John Chrysostom and St. Basil the Great. So in the rite of Constantinople, in the Constantinopolitan Cathedral of Hagia Sophia, the liturgy which was celebrated is the same liturgy which we celebrate today. That is the same. They use the same liturgical books as the same Evchologian, same pre-service book, but the order of the divine office, the order of daily services, would be according to a different order. So most likely they would encounter, if they would count for liturgy, they would likely encounter another procession corresponding to the element of the service which is known to us as a small or little entrance. That procession was an actual entrance into the church building from the outside, either from one of the forums in Constantinople, open-air forums, or from a spacious narthex of Hagia Sophia, where the people, choirs, clergy, the patriarch, and the emperor, when they were available, they would be assembled together before the magnificent doors of the nave. And would you slide? So the dome of Hagia Sophia, which I will refer to it shortly. So then this is the plan of Hagia Sophia, ground plan, where you have on the farther left you have the atrium, and the next space is the narthex. So in the clergy, people and dignitaries would assemble before the magnificent doors of the nave. Next one. Yes, and they would pray, sing the antiphons, the psalms chanted with refrains. And during this third antiphon, Psalm 94, beginning, "O come, let us rejoice in the Lord, let us make a joyful noise to God our Savior." Of course, this is still the antiphon which we sing at daily liturgy, weekly liturgy, when there are no commemorations. And they would enter during this third antiphon, when the sixth verse of that antiphon would be chanted, which is, "Come, let us worship and fall down before Christ." Of course, if you open an actual Psalter, and you would see that these words in the Psalms, in the Psalter, this phrase sounds, "Come, let us worship and fall down before Him." And so, because of this substitution, we don't usually recognize that verse as a quotation from the Psalm, quotation of Psalm 94. And it's quotation of Psalm 94, not chosen randomly, but precisely because that was usually on a Sunday, that would be the third antiphon. And the refrain would be, "O Son of God, who rose from the dead, save us who sing to Thee, Alleluia." And this verse would be solemnly chanted, and the importance of this verse would be further intensified with the kind of a visual commentary. So on the left, you have the photograph of the triple doors and leading from the narthex into the nave, and the central doors would actually be designated as Basilica Pile, or the royal doors. So, or imperial doors, precisely because it is only the Vasilevs and the patriarch, emperor and the patriarch, who would enter through that doorway. And basically, to emphasize this, that this entrance is the act of worship, you have a fresco above, actually a mosaic, I think, above the doorway, which is enlarged on the right, where you see an emperor prostrating before Christ, who is enthroned. That is the earthly king prostrating himself before the King of Kings, who is actually enthroned as the emperor, kind of emphasizing that there is the most powerful man on earth, the most powerful man in the ecumeny, the highest magistrate of the empire, humbles himself, humiliates himself before the King of Kings. The similar visual commentary on the imperial power you will also see in some occasions at the arrangement of the way the procession of the great entrance. And while the term little entrance is relatively late, the term great entrance is actually it's actually attested in some of these earlier sources, because it was a grand procession. Could you scroll back to the ground plan? Yes. So in the ground plan of Hagia Sophia, you see that would be north. So the northeastern side of the church, you see a rotundal building, which was called Scephalachion. That was the place where the vessels, relics, and the church vestments were stored, but also that would be the place where the proskomedy or the prothesis would be celebrated, would be served. And the gifts would be prepared before the beginning of the liturgy at that location, at this building, which also predates the 6th century Hagia Sophia. The building is older. The building is still there. It's not, there's actually nothing in it. It was completely emptied out. So the building belongs actually to the previous Hagia Sophia, which has burned out, burned down. I think, no, it was actually Hagia Sophia, which was rebuilt after the first Hagia Sophia burned down. First Hagia Sophia burned down in the course of the riots following the expulsion of St. John Chrysostom from Constantinople. People didn't really like that. So gifts would be prepared there, and then before, as part of the preparation, before the service of the anaphora, before the offering of Eucharistic prayer, as part of pre-anaphoral rites, the procession would leave the sanctuary of the Hagia Sophia and would exit the building, pick up the gifts, and then bring them back in the form of this grand, majestic, magnificent procession. There is also kind of speculation which door precisely they used to enter, but this is a minor speculation. And the point being that when the gifts are needed, they would be brought, but not brought and offered by the people that we rather see in the more characteristics of the Western Rite, of the Latin Rite, where people did apparently originally bring the offerings before the anaphora. Here, if people brought the offerings for the liturgy, they did it before the liturgy, where gifts would be properly arranged and prepared, and then at the right moment they would be retrieved by the clergy, but not just by the clergy, by the junior clergy. Incidentally, of course, if you've seen hierarchical liturgy many times, and you notice that bishop never goes to get the gifts. He might go to the table of oblation, he might make his own commemorations, because that's actually his last chance to do that, before this last possible moment when you can do that, and before the gifts are removed from the table of oblation. But the bishop then doesn't carry the gifts, he receives them in the holy doors. And that is also characteristic which can be traced back to the architectural setting and the liturgical or order of Hagia Sophia. That's because the bishop is, well, I mean, to put it bluntly, he's too important to run back and forth between the Scalaphylakion and sanctuary. So he is there to be kind of as an icon of Christ receiving the gifts which are being brought, receiving them and depositing them upon the holy table. And as part of this procession, we also know that when emperor was present in the Church of Hagia Sophia, was present at the liturgy, when the procession reached the middle of the church, middle of the nave, the emperor would take a candle and would walk before the holy gifts, preceding them and leading them before the gifts actually brought into the holy doors. And again, emphasizing very strongly that the deference of the earthly authority, earthly political authority, to the authority of the King of Kings. Because at the same time, since at least meets the end of 6th century, people would hear the the cherubic hymn being sung at the same time, and the cherubic hymn simply, of course, specifically mentions the King of all who comes invisibly upborne or escorted by the angelic hosts. The term escorted is a technical term for not just to accompany, escort, but to serve, escort as a bodyguard. So the image which was presented before the people's minds is a emperor walking in a procession surrounded by his bodyguards. And probably in the case of Byzantine emperors would be the Pomeranians or Slavs. But basically, you see that picture, and then the emphasis of that, the emphasis here would be that, yes, so this is the image which you see when the emperor processes, but now instead of the earthly king, we have the gifts, which will become the body and blood of Christ, in which Christ will be the true king of the universe, true king of all, would be truly present. So when we look at the and then all of this procession would take place in this magnificent architectural space under this wonderful dome, which would be, which you saw just on the one other picture, would be, of course, shining with gold, and even more than today. And the effect is you saw that there are many windows surrounding the dome, and that will, of course, will have the effect of creating the impression, will create an impression of this gilded dome, almost like floating in the air. And so, truly, I think when you imagine that in your mind's eye, you can truly kind of appreciate the point which was made by the kind of the comment which was made first by Justinian himself, and when the temple was, when the Church of Hagia Sophia was rebuilt and dedicated, and then by famous delegation of the Rus, which was, according to the probably a legend preserved in the chronicle, in the Russian primary chronicle, was sent by Prince Vladimir to look at how Greeks worship. But famously, Justinian, the story about Justinian is that when the church was dedicated, Justinian, instead of just walking through the royal doors with the patriarch, that he left the patriarch behind, and he ran up just directly under the dome, stretched out his hand and said, "I conquered the Solomon." Why? Because he has built a temple. He actually built a temple which was better, which in his mind was better than the first temple. Was better than the temple built according to the pattern of the tabernacle, mosaic tabernacle, and mosaic tabernacle itself was built, as Exodus makes the point, it built according to the model revealed in the heaven. So he has built a true temple. He has built a temple on earth. But of course, this is a spontaneous comment, and we can speculate whether it actually did happen, or is it just a very interesting story, colorful story from 9th century source. But nevertheless, the point is clear. The Hagia Sophia tried to represent as close as possible this impression that when we enter into the celebration of the divine liturgy, we enter into the concelebration with angelic hosts. When we into this concelebration, when we sing the angelic songs, which is Isaiah 6, Holy, 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 Lord of Sabaoth, is an angelic song, but that angelic song is sung to the crucified and sacrificed Lamb. This is a celebration when because we offer praise and worship and glory to God, we become like angels, whose nourishment is, for course, St. John of Damascus. St. John of Damascus says the nourishment of the angels is the vision of God. So when we worship when we as Christians worship crucified and sacrificed Lamb, our nourishment by which we truly see and know the only true God is the body of the Lord, is the flesh of the only begotten Son, So most of all, when we enter into this celebration, and if you read the prayer of the entrance, which is read silently before the small entrance, before the little entrance, you see that there is the emphasis on angelic celebration is very, very clear, or angelic consolation. We enter so that for the service of thy glory. We enter for the service of God's glory. And it's not simply the service of glorification, it's service of incarnate, who is Christ. And we ask that with this entrance, there may be an entrance of the holy angels who can celebrate with us and with us glorify thy goodness. So we have a kind of a double concelebration. Angels can celebrate with men, men can celebrate with angels, but most importantly, we all united together in one worship to the one true God. And that one worship can only come through the worship of only begotten Son, our Lord Jesus Christ. So there is, of course, other examples of this transformation in the practice of the church, because we no longer, of course, the other examples can be cited. That is, we no longer have a small entrance as a procession from the outside into the church. We no longer go and get the gifts from the out building and bring it in a solemn procession. Our churches are significantly smaller, and even, of course, in the Byzantine period, when the same liturgy would be celebrated in other locations, at least by the end of the first millennium, beginning of the second millennium, they most likely did not fetch the gifts from the outbuilding, but had, for convenience like today, had a table of oblation placed inside the sanctuary. But while the practical function of that procession has disappeared, the meaning of that procession has remained. So that when we enter in the course of the little entrance, we enter into the angelical celebration. We enter into the celebration of the divine liturgy in the church, which unites heaven and earth. So likewise, as already mentioned, in that the prophecies, the rite of the prophecies was celebrated in that outbuilding, in that building in that Scilophylacon, the small building where the gifts will be prepared. And if you look at the first one of the earliest manuscripts of the Byzantine liturgy from the end of 8th century, can you scroll forward? I actually don't remember when it appears. One more. Yeah, that one. So in the course of that, these are the first two leaves from the Apologian Barberini Greek 336, which begins with the liturgy of St. Basil. And the first, the title of that order of the liturgy is simply, it says that the divine liturgy of St. Basil, when the priest places the bread upon the discus, he says this prayer. And the prayer which is there is the same prayer which is said by a priest at the end of the rite of the proscomedia. So that's it. That's the whole proscomedia. So that's the whole preparation. And that is most of this preparation of, at that point, preparation of the gifts, which today, of course, it's very elaborate. A priest and deacon have to get to church before, at least 1 hour before, perhaps, and at least at some time, but and start preparing, because it takes time. At this point, most likely the actual physical actions of cutting the lamb and or lambs, most likely at this point, since most likely multiple lambs were consecrated, and it was delegated to the deacons. And then the priest would come in, or if a patriarch was vesting in the same province, his patriarch would say that prayer. He would come in, sense the gifts, and say the prayer, and that's it. Now, from 12th, 13th century, we see the growth of that service of preparation into a very elaborate service, which by its contains features which liken it to the prayer of the Holy Anaphora, specifically because it includes commemorations. And now the commemorations of the living and the dead are, we see that them as delegated, relegated to the extended service of the prophecies, rather than rather than necessarily at the service during the prayer of the Holy Anaphora. Holy Anaphora is the primary location for the recitation of the commemoration of the living and the dead members of the Church. But of course, that prayer has become, gradually become silent. That the anaphora started to be, and as well as other prayers of the liturgy, were recited silently, or rather not audibly by the priests. Hence, it became there was no room and no time to do extended commemorations during the anaphora, and hence it was important. Then it was the next movement to be an national movement is to delegate them to another place in the liturgy where you actually can do multiple commemorations. And so currently what we see now, in the order of the Divine Liturgy, of course, we see that the commemorations continue up until the moment when the gifts are removed from the table of oblation and placed on the holy table. And same at the hierarchical liturgy, the hierarch commemorates, the bishop commemorates the living and the dead, whomever he wishes, as well as everyone who is concelebrating, precisely right before the gifts are removed from the table of oblation. That's kind of the last chance. Another aspect, of course, which we see as undergone significant change. Next slide. You see that it's the manner of reception of communion, and it's just another example of this of the change which has taken place. From the sources, at least from the beginning of the second millennium, we see that the manner of reception of communion by the clergy and by the laity was somewhat slightly different from what we know today. Now, of course, the priests and deacons, bishops and deacons received communion under both kinds separately, body and blood separately, as they do today. However, we see in the order of the hierarchical liturgy from the 12th century, and that seemed to be a common feature until at least 14th, 15th century, that the priests and the deacons and the bishops did not give communion to themselves. They gave communion to one another. That is, even the patriarch would receive communion from another priest. The point here, and it's actually a theological point, that communion is not something which one takes for oneself. Communion is always a gift. And if communion is a gift, then it always has to be given as if from the hand of Christ. But from the hand of Christ, represented by the hand of another priest or a bishop. So, of course, in a couple of centuries that practice went away, since the perception of a strict hierarchical order overcame this symbolic value of reception of communion, the symbol of this earlier practice of reception of communion. But you see on the frescoes and mosaics depicting communion of the apostles that it is Christ who gives the communion of the apostles, of the body and of his blood, and this seemed to be also kind of representing in what was also happening at the altar, kind of mirroring what was happening in the altar, or rather what was happening in the sanctuary, mirrored what was depicted on the walls. That is, no one took communion for themselves, unless of course they were alone. Obviously, that's different. But if during concelebration the priests and bishops gave communion to one another. And likewise, the laity, most likely until around the 10th, 11th century, did not receive communion in the manner in which with which we are familiar. That is, when both body and blood of Christ is given to the laity on a spoon. Most likely, and the reason I'm showing this pictures, this plate here, these are the discuses or patterns which currently you can see in real life in Dunbar Knox Museum in Washington, D.C., but this is a 6th century treasure and hidden most likely during one of the invasions and then rediscovered. So the size of these discuses presupposes that these are discuses which were used for the communion of the laity in order to give them the body of Christ. So it's most before the introduction of the spoon, gradual introduction of the spoon, the reception of the body and blood of Christ from this 4th century, but of course before, was taking place separately under both kinds. But nevertheless, even though it was taking place separately under both kinds, most likely it was also happening in a strict hierarchical order. That the description of liturgy from the late 4th century the apostolic constitutions, which is describing contemporary liturgy, most likely it describes that people come to receive communion after the clergy, but they also come in a correct order. That is, the readers, singers, virgins, monks come first, and then men, and then women. So everyone receives in the same manner, and but everyone receives in a good order, in a strict adherence to the hierarchical order. And Cyril of Jerusalem, if you read his mystagogical commentaries, he actually gives instructions to the newly baptized, that's what his mystagogical catechisms are for. He gives instructions to the newly baptized how should they receive communion. And these instructions is precisely that, and that's next, I think it's next slide, yes. And this is basically, when you approach, do not come with the wrists of your hands extended with your fingers open. Make your left hand a throne for your right, since it's about to receive the king. And cupping your palm, receive the body of Christ, saying amen. Then after you have carefully sanctified your eyes by the touch of the sacred body, receive, being careful not to lose any of it. But and then further, after communicating in the body of Christ, approach also the cup of his blood, not stretching forth your hands, but bowing and saying amen in attitude of worship and reverence. Be sanctified also by receiving the blood of Christ. While the moisture is still on your lips, touch them with your hands and sanctify your eyes and brow and other senses. So it's actually quite opposite what we do currently when those of us who receive from the spoon, and those of us receiving the altar as well, that we try to wash away Holy Communion as soon as possible, so that nothing might be lost. And this is a good and pious attitude, of course. But the good and pious attitude in the late 4th century was actually to anoint yourself with the moisture from the holy blood. Basically, anoint your senses, anoint almost like we get anointed with the oil, with the holy oil, or we anoint ourselves with the holy water. At that point, the pious thing to do would be to anoint yourself with the holy blood. And now, if you would do that, people would probably be scandalized, most likely. But hence, we see that the liturgical customs change, liturgical practices change, but what does not change is the underlying, is the meaning of those rites, is the essence and core of these liturgical celebrations. And so hence, I think my time is running out, and so I would say that the historical study of liturgical rites, as I hope we saw from this series of disparate examples from all over the place from liturgical history, constitutes an important and necessary aspect of our engagement with our liturgical tradition in the ecclesial context. We can study liturgy as a practical discipline, as we are prepared to be ordained, we must learn how to serve correctly and beautifully, maintaining and preserving good order. But in order to penetrate into the meaning of the rites, we need history informed with theological vision. Through the study of the sources and comparative study of liturgical rites across Christian traditions, we learn of what the rite or the element of the rite meant and how did it come to be in this particular form and in this particular tradition. A good knowledge of liturgical history joined with liturgical theology allows us to discern how the rite was understood and how this understanding was reflected in the text of the prayers and in the form of the ritual action. We saw example of the great entrance and little entrance. Example of this interpretation, Simeon of Thessalonica says that the reason the bishop removes his homophorion before the reading of the gospel, as he still does today, is precisely because in the gospel Christ speaks to us directly. So the bishop is no longer by wearing depicts Christ, kind of iconizes Christ by means of wearing an homophorion. But homophorion is removed, it's carried before the gospel, kind of pointing to the gospel as the source of authority which exceeds that of the bishop. And here we see the an action and a liturgical custom joined in with a theological interpretation, which gives us a proper theological focus. And so this study of religion, of course, makes us perceive the dynamic of change and continuity in the Orthodox liturgical tradition, for we can always answer a question which we sometimes ask ourselves or someone else asks us: do we celebrate the same liturgy as holy apostles did? Because and the answer is yes and kind of no. But yes, theologically, absolutely. Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. The gospel is the same, articulated through different words. The form of the rite between the apostolic period and our days have dramatically changed. With respect to historical shape of the texts and rites, historical flesh of the liturgy, just like that of the church, grows and changes while remaining the same in essence, because again, it's same Christ whom we worship and whom we receive in the Eucharist. Reflecting on the mystery of the church, Father George Florovsky specifically thinking about the church as the body that lives through time and history, he emphasized that certainly the church as the body of the living Christ is the vital core to the mystery of salvation, a new creation of God, a mode and locus of Christ's continued presence in the world until the end of time. At the same time, the church is also a true historical institution in earthly and visible reality, and the two aspects of her being, divine and human, must be distinguished but should not be separated. Likewise, the church's worship, her liturgy, in which the church expresses who she truly is, the body of Christ, the bride of Christ, the temple of God, that worship has a historical aspect which grows and changes while remaining the same in essence and identity. The church is the immaculate mystical body which unites heaven and earth, angels and men, saints and sinners, living and dead. The church is God's temple consisting of living human souls, and that body reveals who it is, who she is in worship, through the liturgy. But the historical development of the liturgy of the church gives us insight into the thought of the saints who prayed these rites when they emerged, provides us with a corrective against the developments which, due to human fallenness and error, may have unintentionally, mostly, obfuscated the significance and purpose of these rites. There are such mundane things as scribal errors, lost manuscripts, mistranslations, misinterpretations, and the study of the sources which is informed with theological vision, theological perspective, can lead us to correct some of what was misinterpreted. At the same time, we do not consider ourselves, particularly the scholars, not just pastors, but we don't consider ourselves to be, God forbid, authors or co-creators of the tradition. But we hope to be faithful recipients, the instruments to preserve and pass it on. But while passing it on, we of course change it, however minute and small these changes might be. So we respect the authority of the reception of the liturgical tradition and see the purpose and meaning in the historical development. We see the hand of providence in the way the liturgy changes, if such changes do not omit the elements that contradict the essence of the liturgy. And thus, turning to the past can absolutely and can empower us to look to the future, can help us to refresh and revitalize our understanding of the received form of the rite-of-this of the liturgy which we celebrate. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Vitali. So we'll take, let's take a 15-minute break. Why don't I say 10-minute break? Because we know when we'll come back. So at 5 after 3, we'll start up again, and we'll go into our Q&A session. All right?